Welcome to the Robert Judat podcast, where intelligence sharpens in the dark. Research-driven, LLM-forged, human-verified. Stay curious.
An AI system helped plan a military operation, and when investigators later asked how it reached its recommendations, nobody could fully explain it. Not the engineers, not the commanders, not the company that built it. That's not a hypothetical. That's the world we're already living in. Today, we're getting into the legal, ethical, operational, and command authority limits around AI on the battlefield, specifically what the rules actually say, where the most dangerous gaps are, and what happens to accountability when an algorithm makes the call. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why the governance debate is so urgent, what real conflicts are already revealing about the stakes, and why the question of who controls the kill switch is one of the defining challenges of our era. I've got someone here who's been deep in this material, and I want to start with something that I think will reframe the whole conversation.
Let's get into it, because I think most people's mental image of this topic is still very science fiction, killer robots, Terminator, that kind of thing. And the reality is both more mundane and more alarming than that.
Right. So let's actually ground this. When we say autonomous weapons systems, what are we actually talking about?
So the ICCRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, defines autonomous weapon systems, or AWS, as weapons that, once activated, can select and engage one or more targets without further human intervention. The key phrase there is without further human intervention. After activation, strikes are triggered in response to environmental inputs and generalized target profiles, so the human user cannot determine in advance who or what will be struck, or exactly when or where the force will be applied.
That's a pretty stark definition. And these things are already deployed?
They are. The ICCRC's own position paper from late 2025 acknowledges that AWS are already used in contemporary conflicts against military objectives like missiles, radars, and warships, often in environments where civilians are absent or excluded. But the concern is that the constraints on where and against what these systems can be used are loosening, and swarm technologies and AI-integrated targeting are accelerating that.
And there's a specific term for the most dangerous category here: LAWS, lethal autonomous weapon systems, sometimes called killer robots.
Yeah, and according to the US Department of Defense's own definition, once activated, LAWS are capable of selecting and engaging military targets autonomously without further input from human operators. A Stanford analysis from early 2025 noted that these systems can potentially operate across unmanned aerial vehicles, naval vessels, and ground robots. So we're talking about a multi-dimensional capability that extends from conventional battlefields into cyber and space domains.
Okay, so this isn't just drones. This is a whole ecosystem of systems that can act without a human pulling the trigger in real time.
Exactly. And here's the thing that I think gets lost in the public debate. Autonomous weapons are not actually a new concept. The Lieber Institute at West Point published a really useful piece on this earlier this year, pointing out that naval mines, torpedoes, cruise missiles, these have been operating without real-time human input for decades. The 1997 Ottawa Convention banned anti-personnel mines precisely because they're indiscriminate. They can't distinguish between civilians and combatants. So the legal and ethical framework for regulating autonomous lethality already exists. What AI does is change the scale, the speed, and the opacity.
The opacity part is what gets me. You can understand how a mine works. You can't always understand how a machine learning model reaches a targeting decision.
That's exactly the problem the ICC flags. They specifically call out systems that function in opaque ways, where machine learning allows the system's functioning to change after being activated, which prevents the user from understanding, predicting, or explaining the system's output. And under international humanitarian law, a weapon whose effects you can't predict or control is potentially indiscriminate by nature. That's a legal problem, not just an ethical one.
So walk me through what international humanitarian law actually requires here, because I think a lot of people assume there are already clear rules.
So the core principles come from the 1949 Geneva Conventions and their 1977 Additional Protocol 1. You've got 4 key principles: distinction, you have to be able to tell combatants from civilians; proportionality, the harm to civilians can't be excessive relative to the military advantage; precaution, you have to take steps to minimize civilian harm; and the Martens Clause, which is a catch-all that says where sees Code Safety Routing, which is a catch-all that says even where specific rules don't exist, parties are still bound by the principles of humanity and the dictates of public conscience.
And the argument is that AI systems can't reliably satisfy those principles?
The ICCC's position is that IHL rules on the conduct of hostilities, distinction, proportionality, precautions in attack, presuppose context-specific human judgment. And that's the crux of it. These rules were written assuming a human being is making the call, weighing the situation in real time. When you hand that to an algorithm, the legal framework starts to strain.
So what does the US military's own policy say about this? Because they're obviously not sitting still.
So there's DoD Directive 300009, updated in January 2023, which establishes policy and assigns responsibilities for developing and using autonomous and semi-autonomous functions in weapon systems. And then in January 2026, the Department of War, that's the rebranded Department of Defense under the current administration, released an AI strategy explicitly directing the department to become an AI-first warfighting force across all components. The language is striking. It calls for unleashing experimentation and aggressively identifying and eliminating bureaucratic barriers to deeper integration.
That's a very different tone from let's be careful here.
Very different. And it's happening in direct tension with what's coming from Congress. Just this week, literally June 2nd, 2026, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand announced the Secure and Accountable Military AI Act, which would restrict the Pentagon's use of AI in operations and heavily regulate its use on fully autonomous weapons for domestic surveillance and with nuclear weapons.
Wait, nuclear weapons? AI and nuclear weapons in the same sentence?
That's one of the high consequence categories Gillibrand specifically names: nuclear missions, lethal targeting, domestic surveillance, and cyber. Under her bill, those uses would require written approval from an undersecretary or the Joint Chiefs Vice Chairman. And she's also requesting a 15-day notification to congressional defense committees before using AI for those operations, or 48 hours after deployment in certain circumstances.
So there's a real legislative fight happening right now over where the lines get drawn.
And it's not just a fight between parties, it's a fight between branches of government and between the executive and the private sector. The same day Gillibrand proposed her safeguards, President Trump signed an executive order calling for AI to be deployed rapidly to confront any and all threats to the United States. The order explicitly said the US refuses to stifle innovation with overly burdensome regulation. So you have a senator saying slow down and a president saying speed up on the exact same day.
That's a pretty extraordinary collision. And Gillibrand's bill, is it gaining traction?
According to Defense One's reporting, other lawmakers haven't joined the legislation yet. But Senator Elise Slotkin is reportedly planning to tuck a similar AI guardrails bill into the National Defense Authorization Act. So there are multiple legislative efforts converging on the same problem from different angles.
And there's also a private sector dimension here that I find really interesting, the Anthropic situation.
Yeah, this is a remarkable story. Anthropic, the AI company, spent the first months of 2026 in a legal confrontation with the US Department of Defense over the potential use of its technology for autonomous weapons. And then in May, Anthropic's co-founder Christopher Olah stood at the Vatican's Synod Hall alongside Pope Leo XIV when the Pope released his first encyclical, which explicitly declared lethal autonomous weapons systems morally impermissible. Okay, I have to stop you there. The Pope weighed in on killer robots?
In a 42,300-word encyclical titled Magnifica Humanitas, Magnificent Humanity, released in May 2026. Pope Leo XIV stated that entrusting lethal decisions to autonomous systems is not permissible, that no algorithm can make war morally acceptable, and that unmanned weapon systems lower the psychological threshold for conflict by distancing societies from the human cost of violence. He also warned that some autonomous weapon systems have advanced practically beyond any human reach to govern them.
That phrase, practically beyond any human reach to govern them, that's a pretty alarming thing for a head of state, even a religious one, to say publicly. And he called for international coordination on AI governance comparable to nuclear arms control, which is actually a comparison that's been made in academic circles too. A Stanford analysis from early 2025 explicitly drew the parallel between laws governance debates and Cold War nuclear arms control negotiations, arguing that the urgency is comparable.
That's a fascinating parallel. Because nuclear arms control took decades and multiple near catastrophes to get right. And we don't have decades here.
We really don't, and the evidence for that urgency is already on the ground. Sudan is probably the most documented case of what happens when autonomous drone warfare meets a complete governance vacuum.
Tell me about Sudan, because I think this is where the abstract debate becomes very concrete and very human.
The conflict in Sudan erupted on April 15, 2023, between Sudan's armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces, and analysts have described it as a live laboratory for autonomous drone warfare and AI-assisted surveillance. Both sides deployed commercially sourced unmanned aerial vehicles, Turkish-made Bayraktar TB2s, China's Winglong 2, and FH-95. The Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project recorded more than 1,003 drone strikes between April 2023 and January, accounting for more than 2,200 civilian deaths. Over 2,000 civilian deaths from drone strikes.
And 80% of those deaths occurred in 2025 alone. What makes Sudan particularly significant is that AI-enabled swarm drone technology entered the theatre for the first time, enabling coordinated autonomous strikes with minimal human oversight. And in December 2024, there was an attack on a hospital in Kalogi that killed more than 114 people. And it exemplified how algorithmic targeting can produce mass casualties at a speed that accountability mechanisms simply cannot match.
A hospital. And there's no clear accountability framework for who is responsible for that.
That's exactly the accountability gap.
And it's not unique to Sudan. The Center for International Governance Innovation published an analysis in May 2026, noting that across the wars in Ukraine, Gaza, and Iran, AI is reshaping how targets are identified, how quickly decisions are made, and who holds power over life and death. And the result is a battlefield increasingly shaped by data, algorithms, and machine-assisted judgment that is, quote, governed, for now, by no one.
Governed by no one. That's a sentence that should make everyone uncomfortable, and the UK is grappling with this in a very direct way right now. A legal analysis published on June 1st, 2026 in Lawyer Monthly laid out the problem clearly. Current UK policy states there should be context-appropriate human involvement in weapons that identify, select, and attack targets. Britain has told the United Nations it doesn't possess fully autonomous weapons operating outside human responsibility and has no intention of developing them. But senior defence figures have simultaneously suggested there may be circumstances where military systems need to operate without direct human involvement because adversaries won't follow the same restrictions.
So the UK is essentially saying we won't do it and we might have to do it at the same time.
That tension is real and it's not unique to the UK. It reflects a fundamental operational dilemma. Modern battlefields often move faster than humans can react. The Center for International Governance Innovation Analysis makes this point. AI can connect raw data and military action at a speed and scale that would be impossible for humans in real time. And by reducing the time required to identify and strike targets, it may also inadvertently lower the threshold for the use of force.
So faster decisions might actually mean more conflict, not less.
That's the concern. Faster decision-making can come at the expense of deliberation, thus increasing the likelihood of escalation. And this connects to something the Global Challenges Foundation flagged in their risk report. AI-driven decision support systems often operate with limited predictability and transparency, making it difficult for users to understand and trust their analyses and outputs. The competitive drive among states to adopt these technologies risks premature deployment before they're sufficiently tested.
And there's a really counterintuitive argument I want to get into here because I think it challenges the instinct most people have about this. The idea that humans must always be in the loop. Is that actually the right answer?
This is where it gets genuinely complicated. An analysis published by the Modern War Institute at West Point in April 2026 makes a provocative argument that in military contexts, late-stage human-in-the-loop overrides are actually the least trustworthy and effective way to fix errors that arise from algorithmic systems. The reasoning is that in military engagement, errors can be lethal, time is compressed, uncertainty is pervasive, and decisions are often irreversible.
Wait, so the argument is that human oversight in the moment might actually make things worse?
The argument is more nuanced than that. The West Point analysis uses what it calls the white van problem. Imagine in a combat zone, intelligence has associated a threat with a white van. Information is scant. Any white van might be benign or might be carrying combatants or explosives. A human operator under stress, fatigue, and incomplete information is making a judgment call. And the argument is, if the contextual cues that guide that human judgment are sufficiently systematic, they can in principle be incorporated into a model. And if the alternative is human intuition shaped by stress and fatigue, then human override power is not a reliable basis for life and death decisions.
That's a genuinely uncomfortable argument to sit with. Because on one hand, it makes a kind of logical sense. On the other hand, it feels like it's building a case for removing humans from the equation entirely.
And that's exactly the tension. The Global Challenges Foundation's analysis pushes back on that conclusion. It argues that determining responsibility for battlefield decisions must remain a human function, grounded in contextual understanding rather than technical indicators alone, to ensure compliance with international humanitarian law and the preservation of moral agency in war. So you have serious analysts on both sides of this.
And the Marine Corps University published something on this too, right? About AI in the military decision-making process?
Yes, a piece in the Journal of Advanced Military Studies by Major Vincenzo Gallitelli of the Italian Army, examining the integration of AI into what the military calls the MDMP, the military decision-making process. It looks at an experimental system called COA-GPT, which generates multiple courses of action for commanders. And while it acknowledges AI's potential to accelerate operational tempo and reduce cognitive burdens, it warns against over-reliance on quantitative metrics and algorithmic outputs. It draws on Clausewitz's principles to argue that the enduring uncertainty and friction of war cannot be captured by purely mathematical or deterministic models.
Clausewitz and GPT in the same sentence. That's a sentence I didn't expect to hear today. The article also invokes Robert McNamara's body count metric from Vietnam as a historical warning, a case where quantitative indicators completely failed to capture the reality of the conflict and led to catastrophic strategic miscalculation. The argument is that AI's risks of overfitting, black box opacity, and the exclusion of moral and contextual factors are a modern version of the same trap. So the lesson from Vietnam is, be very careful about letting metrics substitute for judgment. Exactly. And that lesson applies directly to the command authority question. The DoD's own Developmental Test and Evaluation of Autonomous Systems Guidebook, published in September 2025, acknowledges that a key challenge of testing autonomous systems is that a human operator is absent from continuous control, requiring the system to perform what they call ODA loop operations, observe, orient, decide, act, through a diverse range of environmental and mission conditions. And the guidebook notes that when autonomous systems take physical actions independently and without human control, safety responsibilities shift from the user to the designer, developer, and tester. So the liability shifts upstream to the people who built the system, not the people who deployed it.
In theory. But in practice, as the UK legal analysis points out, when civilians are harmed or a target is wrongly identified, courts, governments, and regulators are still likely to look for human or institutional accountability, even if software played a central role in the decision. The accountability gap is real because the legal frameworks haven't caught up with the technology.
And that gap is being exploited in real conflicts right now. Sudan being the clearest example. Sudan is the clearest example, and the governance failure there is multi-layered. The analysis from Accord notes that Iran, Russia, and the United Arab Emirates have all supplied drone technology to parties in the conflict in exchange for strategic concessions, turning Sudan into a proxy theater for emerging technology warfare. So any regulatory response has to engage international supply chains, not just domestic deployments. The African Union's peace architecture was conceived before the AI era and is dangerously under-equipped to govern these technologies.
And the Philippines raised this at the UN too, the point that governance frameworks can't be shaped solely by the countries with the most advanced technology. Right, Philippine UN representative Enrique Manalo said exactly that during Protection of Civilians Week in May 2026. He warned that the swift progress of AI is surpassing international governance and institutional capacity, and that the perspectives of developing countries, affected communities, and vulnerable populations must be reflected in any governance framework. Because right now, the countries most affected by autonomous weapons in conflict are often the ones with the least say in how they're regulated.
That's a power asymmetry that doesn't get talked about enough. The people setting the rules are not the people bearing the consequences.
And Pope Leo XIV made a version of that argument too. that AI cannot remain in the hands of a few. His encyclical called for international coordination comparable to nuclear arms control, and he argued that governance frameworks cannot be shaped solely by those with the most advanced technological capabilities. Coming from the Vatican, that's a moral argument, but it maps directly onto the geopolitical reality.
Let me ask you something that I think is the hardest question in all of this. Is there a version of this where we get it right, where the governance actually keeps pace with the technology?
The honest answer is, it's possible, but the window is narrowing. The ICCRC has called on states to urgently establish new legally binding rules with clear prohibitions and restrictions on autonomous weapon systems. The Gillibrand bill in the US is one attempt at a domestic framework. The UN discussions are ongoing, but the Global Challenges Foundation's assessment is that governance efforts are too slow and too fragmented to keep up with the rapid technological advancements. And the AI Cold War dynamic, where the US, China, and Russia are all racing to integrate AI into military command systems, creates enormous pressure to move fast and worry about rules later.
Move fast and worry about rules later. That's a philosophy that's caused problems in tech before, and the stakes here are orders of magnitude higher.
Significantly higher. And there's one more dimension worth naming, the private sector's role. Project Maven, the DoD initiative launched in 2017 to accelerate AI adoption in military intelligence, integrates hundreds of data sources and uses machine learning to identify patterns and suggest targets. Companies like Palantir Technologies have provided AI-enabled platforms in Ukraine that fuse satellite imagery, drone feeds, and battlefield data for real-time targeting. Anduril Industries' autonomous drone systems are used for surveillance and strike missions. These are private companies making decisions that have profound implications for international law and human life.
And Anthropic's confrontation with the DoD shows that not all of those companies are comfortable with where this is heading.
Exactly. And that internal tension within the private sector between companies that want to work with the military and companies that are drawing ethical lines is itself a form of governance pressure. It's messy and it's not a substitute for law, but it's real.
So, when you step back from all of this, the legal frameworks, the real-world conflicts, the legislative battles, the philosophical debates about human judgment, what does this really come down to? It comes down to a question of moral agency. The ICCRC's position is that IHL rules presuppose context-specific human judgment, that the laws of war were written for humans making decisions, not algorithms. The West Point analysis challenges whether human judgment in the moment is actually reliable. And the Sudan case shows what happens when neither humans nor laws are effectively in control. We're in a moment where the technology has outrun the governance at every level: legal, ethical, operational, and command authority. And the consequences of that gap are already being measured in civilian lives.
And the accountability question, who is responsible when an AI system contributes to a fatal mistake? That's still genuinely unresolved. Genuinely unresolved. The UK's legal framework says context-appropriate human involvement. But what does that mean when the system is operating faster than a human can process? The DoD's testing guidebook acknowledges that safety responsibilities shift to designers and developers when humans are removed from continuous control. But that hasn't been tested in court in a military context. And the ICCC is calling for new legally binding rules precisely because the existing framework wasn't designed for this.
Here's what I keep coming back to. We started this conversation with the image of an AI system making recommendations that nobody could fully explain. And everything we've discussed, the IHL principles, the Gillibrand bill, the Sudan strikes, the West Point analysis, all of it circles back to that same problem. When you can't explain the decision, you can't assign responsibility. And when you can't assign responsibility, you can't have accountability. And without accountability, the laws of war become suggestions.
That's exactly right. And the Global Challenges Foundation puts it starkly: determining responsibility for battlefield decisions must remain a human function, grounded in contextual understanding rather than technical indicators alone. That's not an argument against AI in defense. It's an argument for building the governance architecture before the technology makes it impossible to do so.
And the window for doing that is closing.
The window is closing. The AI Cold War framing from the Marine Corps University analysis is apt. Major powers are investing billions in military AI with full awareness that it confers decisive strategic advantage. That competitive pressure doesn't pause for treaty negotiations.
So, what's the actionable insight here for someone listening to this who isn't a defense analyst or a senator?
Understand that this is not a distant or abstract problem. The governance decisions being made right now, in the Gillibrand Bill, in the UN discussions, in the DoD's AI strategy, will determine the rules of warfare for a generation. And those rules will affect civilians in conflict zones, the legal accountability of governments and corporations, and the stability of international security. The Philippine representative at the UN was right. Governance frameworks cannot be shaped solely by those with the most advanced technological capabilities. Public awareness and democratic pressure matter here.
And the Pope's framing that the primary choice is not between yes or no to technology, but between what kind of world we're building, that's actually a useful frame for all of us.
It is. The technology is coming regardless. The question is whether we build the guardrails before or after the catastrophe that makes them obviously necessary. Sudan's Kaloji hospital attack, 114 people killed by algorithmic targeting at a speed. Accountability mechanisms couldn't match. That's a preview of what after looks like.
We started this episode with an AI system making recommendations nobody could explain. Here's the thing, that's not the scary part. The scary part is that we're deploying those systems into life and death situations before we've answered the question of who answers for the consequences. The laws of war took centuries to build. AI is dismantling the assumptions underneath them in years. The Gillibrand Bill, the ICCC's call for binding rules, the Pope's encyclical, the UN debates, these aren't bureaucratic noise. They're the sound of humanity trying to catch up with itself. And whether we do, that's still an open question. Thanks for being here for this one on Copilot Podcasts. The conversation isn't over. In fact, it's just getting started.